Part 5. Observation and experiment. Observation is the act or faculty of observing or taking notice with care. To observe is to notice carefully, to turn the attention to regard carefully and attentively for the purpose of discovering, noting, or detecting anything. Thus, you see, observation is the act of attentive perception, exercised for the purpose of discovering, noting, or detecting the qualities or relations of things. It is perception attentively directed and applied with a definite purpose, and that purpose is the discovery of facts concerning that which is observed. In our everyday life, observation constitutes an important factor of efficiency. Men must know something about the things connected with their occupations, and this knowing about is acquired only by investigation, inquiry, and observation. In the keen battle which constitutes the struggle for existence in modern business, industrial or professional life, the efficient observer gradually works to the front, and the poor observer is crowded to the rear. There are, of course, other mental factors involved in success, but, if the faculty of efficient observation be lacking, the other factors are likely to avail little or nothing. The man striving for success must begin by cultivating observation. The man who knows and who knows how is in demand in all walks of life. It will always be found that such knowing is based upon efficient observation. Unless one discovers and detects the qualities and relations of things which are involved in his work and life, he will not know those things. At the last, all that we can know about a thing are the facts concerning the qualities and relations of that thing. We discover these facts only by means of direct or indirect observation. Observation is the basis of all scientific knowledge, of all practical business knowledge, or all practical knowledge of any kind. Observation is a fundamental requisite for success in all lines of human endeavor, and of all individual culture. One may obtain much important theoretical information from textbooks, but such information is actually valuable only when it is added to, or corroborated by individual observation. The real use of textbooks is that of pointing out to one the direction in which he should apply his powers of observation. The ideal plan is to establish a harmonious combination between books and personal observation, but too many omit the latter element of the combination, and thus they become bookish theoretical instead of practical, and are sooner or later pushed aside in the battle of life by the individuals who have supplemented their book knowledge with that gained at first hand by observation. In this connection, moreover, it must not be forgotten that books, insofar as they are practical and useful, are themselves the results of the observation of their authors, or of the authorities accepted by the latter. The entire structure of our scientific and technical knowledge has been evolved slowly from the discoveries made by observation. Qualities and relations of individual objects are first observed, then comparison results and classifications of those objects, according to their degrees of likeness and unlikeness, then general classes and general principles are formulated, and hypotheses are advanced, then experimental observation demonstrates clearly the truth or fallacy of those hypotheses, and, finally, general laws are established. But the entire structure of knowledge rests upon the solid basis of observation. Unless every part of it stands the test of observation, the strength of the whole edifice is doubtful, and its security is questionable. Observation is concerned with facts. Facts are discovered only by observation. Facts constitute the materials for practical knowledge. The practical individual is he who bases his knowledge upon actual observation and upon logical induction and deduction from premises thus supplied. Not only is the know of the practical man derived from observation, but his know-how also comes from the same source. Books are employed by such a man not as fetishes to be bowed down to and worshipped, but rather as valuable servants and assistants to him in his work of observation. To the practical man, the ordinary books do not constitute the text of his book of knowledge, they are to him merely the footnotes of that great volume. Eminent educators are sounding a warning note concerning the tendency to supplant observation by mere books. They insist that unless this tendency be counteracted, observation will become a lost art, and practical knowledge merely tradition. They point out that whatever one learns by direct observation is far better learned than what one learns, or thinks that he learns, from books or the reports of others. They advance the theory that the child should not be taught from books anything which it can observe for itself until after it has employed fully its power of direct observation in the direction of that thing. Books, say they, should be regarded as supplementary to observation. Educational experts have reported a sad deficiency among school children in the matter of the correct observation of familiar objects. For instance, pupils usually are unable to distinguish between marble and granite, or between an oak tree and a beech tree, between cast iron and wrought iron, between iron and steel. Even farmers' children usually are unable to state correctly whether the ears of the cow are in front of her horns or behind them, over them or under them, whether cats descend trees head first or hind feet first, whether horses and cows rise with their fore or hind feet first, and whether horses and cows differ from each other in this respect. Other children are unable to state correctly how many legs has a fly, and how many a spider, whether the fourth hour on the watch dial is designated by the Roman numerals 4 or IEEI, and other presumably familiar facts. As an ideal example of careful and effective observation, we ask you to consider the following statement of Maupassant, in which he relates how Flaubert laid down to him the fundamental rules of literary descriptive expression. Maupassant says that Flaubert told him, "Talent is nothing but long patience. Go to work. Everything which one desires to express must be looked at with sufficient attention, and during a sufficiently long time, to discover in it some aspect which no one has yet seen or described. In everything there is still some spot unexplored, because we are accustomed only to use our eyes with the recollection of what others before us have taught on the subject which we contemplate. The smallest object contains something unknown. Find it. To describe a fire that flames, and a tree on a plain, keep looking, at that flame and that tree until in your eyes they have lost all resemblance to any other tree or any other fire. That is the way to be original." Maupassant adds the following comment: "Having, besides, laid down this truth, that there are not in the whole world 2 grains of sand, 2 specks, 2 hands, or 2 noses exactly alike, Flaubert compelled me to describe in a few phrases a being or an object in such a manner as clearly to particularize it, and to distinguish it from all other beings or all other objects of the same race or the same species. He said to me, when you pass a grocer seated at his shop door, a janitor smoking his pipe, a stand of hackney coaches, show me that grocer and that janitor, their attitude, their whole physical appearance embracing, likewise, as indicated by the skillfulness of the picture, their whole moral nature, so that I cannot confound them with any other grocer, or any other janitor. Make me see, in one word, that a certain cab horse does not resemble the 50 others that follow or precede it." George Randolph Chester, the popular story writer, gives to those who seek to become writers the following advice concerning the important part played by observation in the work of the writer: "Observation is the faculty upon which both creation and imagination are built. After all, we have finite minds, and man only creates after known forms, he only imagines upon material foundations. Our most brilliant castles in the air but more delicate variants of familiar structures of brick and stone. The most expert builders of air castles, then, are those who have most closely observed and mentally indexed to minutest detail our mundane castles. There is no end of information, scarcely obtainable from referencia books, which the observing mind will and must acquire. What trees are indigenous to certain localities, and what are their characteristics of sprouting their leaves and developing and shedding them, of blossoming and budding and bearing fruit? Have you noticed how the white undersides of leaves, while fluttering up in a breeze, give quite a different shade of green to a tree? Have you observed the differing apparent color of still or running water at differing times of the day, at differing times of the year, under differing atmospheric conditions? How many common insects can you recall and describe? What effect has a frown upon the other features of man's countenance? How many sorts of sunsets, as infinite in their variety as the shapes of clouds, can you at this moment mentally catalogue and briefly describe? Have you ever noticed the peculiar heave of the body given by a man straightening up under a hoddled brick, or the unconscious rhythmic pauses, for rest of the muscles, indulged in by a man mixing mortar? The importance of this faculty can scarcely perceptive power be overestimated, as you will discover to your later humiliation if you set down details without knowing them to be entirely accurate. The 3 factors of efficient observation. Your attention is now called to the 3 factors of efficient observation, i.e., the 3 elemental and fundamental elements of efficient observation. I. Attention. It is scarcely necessary to do more than merely to call your attention to the fact that attention is the first requisite of purposeful observation, attention being the key to perception, and perception being the basis of observation. It follows that attention is the prime factor of efficient observation. Your observation becomes effective in the degree in which your attention is directed to the task, the degree in which you consciously and voluntarily attend to it. A subsequent section of this book is devoted to the special consideration of the subject of attention. 2. Interest. Attention proceeds along the lines of interest. The greater interest an object or a subject possesses for you, the greater degree of attention do you direct toward it. You will perceive this fact more fully in your consideration of the subject of attention in a subsequent section of this book. In this connection, it should be noted that interest may be awakened, stimulated, and continued by attention intelligently applied under the rules of attention which we shall present for your consideration in that section of this book in which the subject of attention is considered in detail. 3. Discrimination. One may cultivate observation on general principles by directing it to all objects, without regard to their importance, essentiality, or special purpose. But such observation will not be efficient observation. Efficient observation requires discrimination along the lines of purpose. Efficient observation is purposive observation. Purposive observation is observation directed toward the discovery and detection of facts which will be useful to you in the general or special fields with which are concerned your work, your recreation, your studies, your culture. If you proceed upon the principle that any and all kinds of observation, the observation of all manners, sorts and kinds of things is efficient observation, you will have failed to catch the spirit of this instruction. If you had all eternity in which to observe, and in which to accomplish an infinity of creative work, then this indiscriminate observation might serve your purposes and thus be advisable. But, inasmuch as you have only a limited time in which to observe, and a limited number of tasks possible of attainment by you in this life, then it behooves you to exercise an intelligent discrimination concerning the general or special classes of objects or subjects toward which you are to exercise efficient observation. To observe on general principles is as impracticable and inefficient as to think on general principles. In either case you will get nowhere, as the current idiom so forcibly expresses it. In such cases you will be so occupied in observing or thinking about the non-essentials that you will have no time left in which to observe or think about the essential, necessary, efficient things in your particular field of activity. You will be like the squirrel in his wheel, continually traveling but never arriving anywhere. You will simply be wasting your time and energy. Your efficient observation, then, must have a definite purpose, and must proceed in a definite direction. It must be concerned with the lines of activity which represents your chief purposes in life, and it must be kept within at least the general limits of such purposes. This purposive observation may proceed along two general lines, viz. 1. Simple observation, i.e., the observation of the qualities of the objects brought into attention by reason of their presence in or association with your general or special lines of work or study, to the end that you discover and detect so far as is possible their general character and nature, i.e., the whatness of them. 2. Experimental observation, i.e., the observation of the aforesaid classes of things along the lines of trial, experiment, or test directed to the discovery and detection of their workability in certain directions, the way in which they will work or work out under certain applied conditions. In the latter form of observation the assistance of constructive imagination is required. In simple observation you merely discover or detect certain qualities or circumstances concerned with the object under observation. In experimental observation you proceed to change or vary the circumstance, that you may perceive the working out of those qualities under different relations. In simple observation you simply watch natural phenomena. In experimental observation you set nature to work in order to make further discoveries or to detect the results arising from new conditions. Thus, man for centuries observed the phenomena concerned with thunderstorms, and learned some very important facts concerning them. Later, Franklin, by means of his kite and key, applied the method of experimental observation to the same phenomena, and discovered the identity of their causing power with the better known forms of electricity. Simple observation is employed in the initial stages of science, art and handiwork. Experimental observation marks their more advanced stages, When the knowledge gained by the simpler phase has greatly progressed and has been subjected to the tests of experiment and trial in many cases and under varying circumstances, in simple observation you observe what exists and what happens without your active interference. In experimental observation you interfere with things, and then watch the result. Experimental observation, therefore, is simple observation plus your deliberate interference with, and regulation of, the active processes of the observed object. Thus, you observe certain actions of a young dog, and make certain discoveries concerning them. Then you proceed by experiment to test the dog's actions under changed conditions and relations with other things, and from the results thus obtained you make additional discoveries which give you a fuller understanding of the actions originally observed. Experimental observation is a shortcut in observation. If you had all eternity in which to observe, and could perceive every national happening anywhere in the universe, then you would not require experimental observation. In such case nature would sooner or later present to your simple observation the entire materials for a complete knowledge concerning all of her processes. But inasmuch as your time and powers of perception are limited, you proceed to take the shortcut of experiment, and thus anticipate many of nature's future and distant revelations and bring to the present time and place the actual events and happenings. Thus, man has discovered by scientific experiment and reasoning many things which would have required innumerable years for him to have discovered by simple observation. The animal and the primitive man employ simple observation alone. Reasoning man has enormously increased his effective power by applying it under the forms and methods of test, trial, and scientific experiment. The following general rules of observation apply more particularly to simple observation along the general lines of perception. Rules of observation. Eye concentration. Employ concentrated attention when you are deliberately observing an object. The clearness of your perception and the strength of its impressions upon your memory depend materially upon the degree of concentration which you apply in the observation. See final section of this book for special instruction concerning concentration. 2. Interest. Throw as much interest as possible into every act of deliberate observation. Interest brings forth the full power of attention, and attention is the working power by means of which effective observation is accomplished. The greater the degree of interest, the easier becomes the application of concentrated attention and its continuance. 3. The whole and the parts. Observe the whole thing before you observe its constituent parts. See the observed thing as a whole, i.e., in its general outlines, in its main characteristics, in its appearance as a whole thing, before you proceed to observe its constituent parts, its details, its minor characteristics. Get your main facts, and your general outlines, well fixed in mind and memory. This done, proceed to add your subordinate parts and to fill in your details. Study first the tree as that whole thing called a tree, until you understand clearly its main characteristics and general outlines. Then proceed to a study of its roots, its trunk, its limb, its branches, its leaves, its blossoms and its fruit. Then proceed to the study of its soil, its normal environment, etc. Observe the tree and its parts in logical sequence and classification. In this way your reasoning powers will be able to take hold of it more effectively, and your memory of it will be much clearer. Lay a sound foundation, and build from the ground upwards. An important psychological principle is involved in this rule. You will do well to make a careful note of it. 4. Reviewing observations. In observing an object subsequently to your original observation of it, review in your memory your previously observed facts concerning that object and then add to these your additional discoveries and detected facts. In this way you combine the two sets of perceived facts in your memory, so that when you think of the one you will also remember the other. You also will thus associate logically the two respective sets of discovered facts, and by so doing will be able to reason far more effectively concerning the entire subject or object of your observation. You will also do well frequently to revive in memory the results of your observations of the object or subject, even though you are not conducting a fresh observation. This for reasons similar to those just mentioned. V. Combined observation. In observing an object, employ as many channels of sense impression as possible. Discover not only how the thing looks, but also, when possible and expedient, how it sounds, tastes, smells, and how it feels to the touch and the muscular sense. This not only because the memory obtains a clearer impression when the reports concerning a thing reach it through several channels, but also because it is probable that certain forms of your sensory perception are more effective than are the others in such case. By this method the weak perceptive via impression of the one sense is reinforced and supported by the strong report from the other sense or senses. By visualized observations, wherever possible, you should endeavor to visualize, or create a mental picture of the object as you have observed it. The better and clearer, the deeper and the stronger, the mental picture of the observed thing you are able to create, the clearer will be your idea concerning it, and the better will you remember the results of your observation. You will do well frequently to recall this picture in recollection. If you are unable to see and remember it clearly, you should remedy the deficiency when you again observe it. Continue this until you can mentally picture and remember it in complete detail, or nearly so. By following this plan you will both know and remember the observed thing, as a whole and in detail, far better than otherwise. 7. Naming observations. Wherever possible, you should endeavor to learn and remember the name of each of the qualities, parts, elements, factors or general and special characteristics of the observed thing. That is to say, just as in the preceding rule you have been advised to visualize or see the observed thing, as a whole and in its parts, so you are now advised to learn the name of such whole and parts. The ancient philosophers, particularly the Oriental teachers, had much to say concerning name and form. They have implied that in the knowledge of name and form consists all possible knowledge of a phenomenal thing. Be this as it may, it is a fact that the better you know the name and form of an observed object and its parts, the better do you practically and effectively know the same and the better do you remember it. Your perceptions of the names and forms of things are the bricks with which are built up the greater part of your structure of knowledge. Add to this your perceptions of how the things act, and there is very little missing in the full conception. Words serve to crystallize thoughts. You will do well to write down the names above referred to. When you are conducting a deliberate and earnest observation of anything, put down on paper the facts which you have discovered and detected in your observation, whenever such is possible and expedient. Review this list frequently, particularly before each new observation of the thing. It is not necessary to go into a technical explanation concerning this principle, enough to know that it is scientifically sound and, above all, that it works out. If, however, you insist upon some sort of an explanation, here is one. Just as words are crystallized observations, so are written or printed words the hard crystals of observation. Unwritten words too often are like the crystals of snow or ice which melt away by reason of a slight change of the emotional temperature. While this is not an academic, technical definition, it is at least an efficient pragmatic explanation. It will work out in actual practice. The general rule. A general rule concerning deliberate and purposeful observation is this: what is worth deliberately observing, is worth observing thoroughly. What is worth observing thoroughly, is worth observing as completely as may be. If you wish to know a thing thoroughly and completely, because of its importance to you as an item of knowledge, you must proceed as does the child sucking a sweet orange. You must extract every drop of sweetness in it. Or, you must be as a weasel sucking an egg. You must suck it dry. Just as the egg is full of meat, or the orange full of sweet juice, so is every worthwhile object full of facts, and it is your business to extract those facts from it. You must attack the observed object from all angles, all sides, not forgetting that everything has two sides, the outside and the inside. You must go to its center and extend your observation to its full circumference. Worthwhile knowledge is the knowledge of facts. Every worthwhile object or subject is full of facts. These facts may be extracted by observation conducted under the principles of scientific analysis, dissection and separation. You, yourself, have all the elements of an efficient observer within you. It is for you to decide, however, whether you wish to express them. We can merely point out the principles to you. You must do the rest. Concluding our consideration of the general subject of observation, we ask you carefully and earnestly to consider the following true incident in the life of an eminent scientist. The story embodies in it most, if, indeed, not all of the essential elements of efficient perception and purposive observation. If you will grasp the spirit of the story, then will you realize just what observation actually is, in its full meaning. When you comprehend the lesson of this true story, then will you understand the art and science of observation. We advise you to fix well in your memory the essential features of this remarkable story, true as it is in every detail and in its sequel. Here follows the story. How Agassiz taught observation. Louis Agassiz was one of the world's greatest naturalists. Moreover, he was renowned as a teacher of his special branch of science. His pupils were noted for their keen powers of perception, scientific analysis and synthesis. He could lecture on the subject of an animal of apparently no interest whatsoever, and his audience would listen as if to an entrancing story. This because he knew the really interesting facts about the apparently uninteresting creature, and could make others perceive them. He taught his students to know the facts of animal life so well that they frequently were able to reconstruct the picture of an animal from being shown merely a few of its unimportant bones. His advice to his students was, see, observe, remember. Interest is the key to these three doors of knowledge. One day there arrived at Agassiz's laboratory a pupil from a distance. He had traveled far to learn the science of zoology at the school of the master. The great teacher, instead of directing him to study certain textbooks, simply made him take a chair. Placing before the seated student a fish taken from its jar of alcohol, Agassiz told him to observe the creature carefully, noting down on paper every fact he could discover from an examination of its body, without cutting it open or using any instruments. He then excused himself, telling the student to continue at his task until his return. The student was a little piqued at the simplicity of the task. He felt that he knew all about a fish's body, but he cursorily examined the specimen more as a matter of politeness and of duty than from any belief in the value of the task or its result. He examined the fish for about 15 minutes, noting down carefully the few things he perceived concerning its shape, size, conformation, color, etc. Then he waited somewhat impatiently for the teacher's return, but the teacher failed to come back to him. He asked the assistants to find the professor, but they reported that he had seemingly dropped out of sight. However, they advised the student to await his return, and to continue the task while doing so. The student was disgusted, to state it mildly. He looked at that fish from nose to tail. He turned it over and looked at the underside of it. He discovered a few additional facts, but very few. He felt that there was no one, even the great teacher, who could discover anything more about that fish. He began to think that he had made a mistake in coming to that particular teacher. The man must be silly to set him at such a task, and then to go away and forget him. He went out for lunch. When he returned, the teacher was still away. The assistants told him that the professor had returned during his absence, and had left word for the young man to continue the task. Said him. Then he became more than disgusted. He was filled with impotent rage. In his anger he took another look at that despised fish. He grew tired of the monotonous gazing at the creature, and in desperation he began to classify and count its scales. This over with, he drew a picture of the fish in order to pass the time. In making the drawing, he discovered that the fish had no eyelids. Agassiz afterward told him that a pencil is the best of eyes. Continuing with the sketch, he made a number of similar discoveries, and finally began to work up a little interest in the task. He forgot his former weariness and disgust, and the returning teacher found him deeply engrossed in his discoveries concerning the fish. But Agassiz said, "You have missed nearly all the interesting points. Keep on observing." The young man felt a bit disappointed, for he had expected to be commended, but he kept on, and was reluctant to leave when called an hour or so later. His interest had begun to awaken. His attention followed interest, and he had begun to manifest purposive observation with concentrated attention. That evening, in his room, the pupil began to think about that fish. He recalled the many facts he had discovered about it, and he began to see where other facts might be sought and found. He became impatient at the slow passage of the time. He longed to be at his work. He had begun to extract facts from that fish, and his intellectual appetite had been sharpened by his success. Attention had awakened interest, and interest has resulted in further and closer attention. He had discovered the endless chain of attention, interest, attention, and so on and on and on. The next day, and for several days thereafter, that student eagerly worked over the same fish. He drew pictures of everything he discovered, and he sought for and wrote down the names of the detected qualities and relations. He had recognized the value of name and form as a working a principle of observation. Aided merely by an occasional general suggestion from the teacher, The young man persisted until he knew practically everything there was to be known about the external facts concerning its habits, etc. When he was finally relieved from his task, it was said that he knew more about that particular kind of fish, from the outside, than any living man except Agassiz himself attribute well worthwhile, his fellow students thought. The student, himself, afterward developed into an eminent scientist, and carried into his own work and instruction the fundamental principles which Agassiz had imparted to him in that lesson upon the fish, trifling and tiresome as the task had at first appeared to be. In after years, when he had won renown and fame on his own account, this only at time student said in a public address, after telling the tale, "That was the best zoological lesson I ever had, a lesson whose influence has extended to the details of every subsequent study, a legacy that Agassiz has left to me, as he left it to many others, of inestimable value, which we could not buy, with which we cannot part." We are not asking you to emulate this student. You probably have different needs and other aims in life. But we do ask you to try to catch the spirit of the teacher, which he successfully passed on to this pupil. Once you have grasped the spirit of the idea, the details will unfold themselves.